Vivian Ashworth was standing in the doorway of her own home when something inside her, quietly, without ceremony, broke. The paper was still folded in her hand, 3 times, the way people fold things they don't want anyone else to open by accident. Behind her, in the kitchen, she could hear Edward humming as he laid out the silver, the soft clink of fork against fork, the particular rhythm of a man who had performed this exact task on this exact date for 11 years running, ever since they'd started hosting the anniversary dinner at home instead of at a restaurant. The sound should have been comforting. It was the sound of 30 years of Tuesdays. It was the sound of a life she had built with her own hands, brick by careful brick, so that nothing in it would ever surprise her. She was surprised. The handwriting on the note had done something to her spine before her mind had even finished reading the words. A recognition that arrived in the body first. The way a smell can put you back in a room you haven't stood in for decades before you've consciously placed it. The slant of the letters. The particular way the tail of the Y curled back on itself, as if reluctant to let go of the line. She had not seen that handwriting in 30 years. She had told herself, across 3 decades, in the specific and disciplined way she told herself many things, that she had forgotten it completely. She had not forgotten it at all. Meet me at the bridge at sunset, just one last time. No signature. There didn't need to be one. Vivian stood very still on the threshold of her own front hall, one hand still resting on the doorframe as though she might need it to stay upright, and she became aware, in that strange suspended way a person becomes aware of things only after a shock, of the clock on the mantel behind her, ticking through the early evening the way it ticked through every evening, indifferent, exact, already counting down toward a sunset that suddenly felt like a deadline rather than a time of day. 4 hours. Perhaps 4.5. Enough time to finish dressing the table, to greet the first guests, to smile at Edward's toast, and also, if she chose it, enough time to be standing on a particular bridge over the Thames, when the light went the color it always went at that hour in early autumn, gold sliding into rust, rust sliding into gray. She did not move for a long moment. The note stayed folded in her palm, her thumb worrying the crease as if she could smooth 30 years flat again just by pressing hard enough. Somewhere behind that carefully maintained face, the face that had conserved manuscripts and rare bindings for a living, that had spent a professional lifetime believing that anything, even the most fragile and water-damaged thing, could be stabilized if you were patient and precise enough. Something had already come loose. Not fallen, not yet, but loose. The way a hinge goes soft years before a door finally comes off it, and you don't notice until the day it simply swings free. Viv, Edward's voice, warm, unbothered, entirely unaware. Did the flowers come, or do I need to ring them again? She opened her mouth. What came out was steady, ordinary, a wife's voice answering a husband's question on the afternoon of their 30th wedding anniversary. They came. I'll bring them in. She did not move to bring them in. She stood at the door a moment longer, the paper folded against her palm like something alive, and somewhere in the part of her mind that had been sealed for 30 years, a woman she used to be opened one eye. To understand what cracked open in Vivian Ashworth on that particular Tuesday afternoon, you have to go back, not gently, the way memory usually asks to be approached, but the way a key turns in a lock that hasn't been used in decades, with resistance, and then, all at once, without any resistance at all. She had been 24 the first time she heard Josephine Calloway play piano, in a basement club in Soho that no longer exists under that name, though the building is still there, now selling craft cocktails to hedge fund analysts who have no idea what happened in that room once the lights went down. In 1996, it was called The Cat's Eye, and it smelled like cigarette smoke and spilled gin and the particular mustiness of 100 years of London damp, and Joe Calloway sat at an upright piano that was slightly out of tune in the upper register and played like she was arguing with someone she loved. Vivian had gone with a friend from the archive where she worked, a girl named Deborah who wanted, badly, for something interesting to happen to her before she turned 25. Something interesting happened, but not to Deborah. Vivian remembered. She would always remember, whether she wanted to or not, the exact moment Joe looked up from the keys between songs, found her in the small crowd, and did not look away. It wasn't forward. It wasn't a performance. It was the specific, unhurried attention of someone deciding, in real time, that they had found what they came to that room to find, even though they hadn't known they were looking. They talked afterward at the bar about nothing, a book Vivian was restoring, a chord progression Joe couldn't get right, whether the rain outside was ever going to stop. It was the kind of conversation that means nothing on paper and changes the shape of a life in the room. By the time Vivian walked home that night, alone, along the Thames, she understood two things clearly for the first time in her life: that she was capable of wanting a woman the way she had never managed to want any of the perfectly nice young men her mother kept arranging into her path, and that wanting this particular woman was going to be, in some fundamental way, a problem. It was 1996. Section 28 was still law. Her mother, Constance Ashworth, née Pemberton Hale, believed that a woman's respectability was the single asset she could not afford to spend carelessly, and she said so, often, at dinner, in the particular tone she used for pronouncements she considered too obvious to require evidence. Vivian's father had died when she was 19, and Constance had spent the years since building, alone, a version of the family's social position that she guarded the way other people guard money. Vivian was the only daughter. There was, in Constance's calculations, no room in that architecture for a woman who loved women, not because she was cruel, exactly, though she could be, but because she genuinely could not imagine, or would not allow herself to imagine, any version of her daughter's future that didn't end at a church altar with a suitable man. Vivian and Joe were together, in the specific quiet way that word meant back then, for 11 months. They met at the club on nights Joe played. They met on the pedestrian bridge across the Thames on afternoons Vivian invented excuses to leave the archive early. The bridge became theirs by accident and then by habit, the halfway point between Joe's flat in Southwark and Vivian's family home in Marylebone, the place where neither of their separate lives could see them standing too close, laughing too easily, for too long. Vivian remembers the bridge in a way she has never let herself examine too closely. The particular cold off the water in November, the exact color the sky went at low tide in September, Joe's hand finding hers on the railing when she thought no one was watching, quick and certain, like a decision she'd already made and would keep making, every single day, if Vivian would let her. Vivian did not let her in the end. Not for lack of wanting to. She has told herself, in the 30 years since, a specific and well-rehearsed version of what happened: that Joe was offered a residency in New York, that the timing was simply wrong, that they were young and frightened, and the world was not built for what they were trying to become inside it, that some things end, not because love fails, but because circumstances refuse to bend. She has told this version of the story so many times, to herself, in the small hours, that she has almost entirely stopped noticing the places where it doesn't hold together, the places where, if she were honest, which she has worked very hard for 30 years not to be, she would have to admit that she was the one who stopped answering, that she was the one who, when her mother sat her down in the parlor and said certain things in a voice iron flat with warning, chose the door marked safe, rather than the door marked Joe. There is a small object in the bottom drawer of Vivian's writing desk, underneath the tax files and the expired passports, that she has moved 4 times across 4 different homes without ever once throwing it away. It is a folded scrap of manuscript paper, soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded more times than she has ever admitted to anyone. 4 bars of music written in pencil in handwriting she would know anywhere. Joe gave it to her the night they met, said it was the beginning of a song she hadn't finished. She's kept it for 30 years the way you keep a wound you've decided to call a scar. Before we go any further, if this is already the kind of story that's settling somewhere behind your ribs, this is a good moment to hit like and subscribe, because there are more stories like Vivian's waiting to be told, and I'd rather tell them with you than to an empty room. Now, back to the bridge, back to the note, back to a marriage that was, By every visible measure, a good one. Edward Ashworth is not a villain in this story, and it would be a disservice to him to make him one. He is 61, silver at the temples in the specific distinguished way that seems to be reserved for men, kind in the unspectacular daily fashion that doesn't photograph well but holds a house together for 30 years. He met Vivian 18 months after Joe left for New York, when Vivian was, by her own private accounting, still bleeding from a wound no one else could see. He was steady, he was patient. He asked for nothing she wasn't ready to give, and in the particular arithmetic of a 26-year-old woman trying to build a life that would never again make her mother look at her with that flat, warning stillness, steady and patient, looked very much like love, and in its own way, over 3 decades, it became love, quieter than the other kind, less like fire and more like the pilot light that keeps a whole house warm without anyone ever really looking at it. They have one daughter, Mia, 29 now, a curator at a small gallery in Hackney, sharp-tongued and soft-hearted in the way of people who spent their childhoods being told, gently but repeatedly, that they were too much. Mia has been carrying her own note under the door all week, though hers isn't paper. It's a sentence, rehearsed in the mirror, in the car, in the silence of her flat at 2 a.m. Mum, I need to tell you something about Priya. She has planned to say it tonight, after the toasts, after the cake, when the wine has done its gentle work and the room feels forgiving. She has practiced the sentence so many times it no longer sounds like words to her, just a shape her mouth knows how to make. Mia had insisted, at 22, on hyphenating her name, Ashworth Reyes, Reyes for her grandmother on her father's side, a fierce, funny woman who had died when Mia was 16, and who had been, as far as Mia was concerned, the only relative who had never once asked her to explain herself. It had seemed, at the time, like a small act of rebellion against a family that specialized in unspoken rules. She had no idea, arriving at her parents' door that afternoon with a bottle of wine and her stomach in knots, how many unspoken rules that family actually had, or how many of them her own mother had been the first to break, quietly, 30 years before Mia was born. The note had arrived. Vivian would work out later, sometime between 3 and 4 that afternoon, slipped under the door while Edward was at the wine merchant's, and she was upstairs steaming the wrinkles out of the tablecloth her mother had left her. The good one, Irish linen, the one that came out only for anniversaries and funerals. She had heard nothing, no knock, no footstep, no shift in the light through the frosted glass panel beside the door. Whoever left it had wanted it that way, had wanted the note to simply exist, the way a fact exists, without the complication of a face attached to it. She found it on her way back down, on the doormat, half tucked under the edge of the runner, and she almost mistook it for a flyer, one of the endless local menus and window-cleaning advertisements that came through that slot 3 times a week. It was the paper that stopped her, heavier than a flyer, cream-colored, folded with a precision that felt deliberate. And then it was the handwriting, and then it was everything at once. The basement club, the out-of-tune upper register, a hand finding hers on a cold railing in November, the particular silence of a parlor in Marylebone 30 years ago, and her mother's voice, flat as a closed door. This is not who you are, Vivian. This is not who this family is. She had stood exactly where she was standing now, in the front hall, one hand on the frame, the tablecloth still draped over her other arm, forgotten, for what felt like a very long time, and was probably closer to 90 seconds, long enough for Edward's key to sound in the lock, for him to come in with the wine cradled against his chest like a small, dignified animal, for him to say, cheerfully, not noticing anything at all, "You'll never guess what they had on for half price," and for Vivian to fold the note into her palm, into her pocket, into the specific practiced smoothness of 30 years spent making sure her face never told anyone anything she hadn't decided in advance to let it tell. That practiced smoothness is, in fact, the exact thing about to fail her. By 6 o'clock, the flat smelled of roasting lamb and lilies, the good candles were lit along the mantel, and the first guests, Edward's brother Alistair and his wife, then 2 old friends from Vivian's archive days, Then Mia, arriving a full 40 minutes before she needed to, wine in hand, jaw already set with the particular determination of someone rehearsing a speech, had begun to fill the front room with the low, comfortable noise of people who have known each other a long time and don't need to work very hard at conversation. Vivian moved through it all, like a woman performing a role she had played so many times she no longer needed to think about the blocking. She poured wine. She laughed at Alistair's joke about the wine merchant, which she had heard 3 times before and would hear at least once more before the night was over. She accepted a compliment about the lamb from Edward's oldest friend and deflected it, correctly, onto Edward, who had in fact done the marinating. Underneath all of it, the note sat folded in the small evening bag she'd swapped her cardigan pocket for once the doorbell started ringing, and every so often, between one sentence and the next, she would feel its edges through the fabric and lose, for a fraction of a second, the thread of whatever she was saying. It was Mia who noticed first, because Mia had spent 29 years learning to read the small tells behind her mother's composure, the same way an art conservator learns to read the fine cracks in old varnish that tell you a painting is not quite what it appears to be on the surface. "You're somewhere else," Mia said, cornering her by the drinks table under the pretense of refilling her glass. "You've done the thing 3 times now where you laugh half a second after everyone else. I'm hosting a dinner for 12 people, darling. I'm allowed to be somewhere else for half a second." "Not you. You've never once in your life been somewhere else at your own dinner party." Mia's eyes, dark and quick and entirely her mother's, narrowed slightly. "Is it Grandma Constance again? Did she call?" "Your grandmother has been dead for 6 years, Mia." That's never stopped her having opinions. It was a joke, and it wasn't. And something in Vivian's face must have moved in a way she didn't intend, because Mia's expression shifted from teasing to something more careful. "Mum, seriously, you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine," Vivian said, in the voice she had used for 30 years to close doors gently, and she picked up the tray of canapés and carried it into the front room before her daughter could ask a third time, because Vivian Ashworth had a great deal of practice at surviving conversations by leaving them. She did not know, standing in that doorway with a tray of smoked salmon blinis, that within the hour, her daughter would be standing in the study with an old silver photo frame in her hands, looking at a photograph that was never meant to be found. It happened because of the flowers, in the end, a small, almost comic detail that Vivian would return to later and turn over and over, the way you turn over any hinge on which an entire life quietly swings. Mia had gone looking for a vase in the study, because the arrangement Edward had bought needed a taller container than anything in the kitchen, and in the study, on the low bookshelf beside her father's desk, sat the photo frame that had held, for as long as Mia could remember, a picture of her parents on their wedding day, Vivian in ivory silk, laughing at something outside the frame, Edward looking at her instead of the camera. The frame had a loose backing. It had always had a loose backing. It was old, a wedding gift from someone long forgotten, and the little metal clasp that should have held the cardboard in place had given up years ago. Mia picked it up to move it, to make room for the vase, and the backing slid, and behind the wedding photograph, tucked flat against the cardboard, clearly placed there on purpose, clearly meant to be hidden rather than lost, was a second photograph. A much younger Vivian, unmistakably, in a coat Mia had never seen, standing on a bridge Mia recognized, because she'd walked across it 100 times herself. And beside her, closer than the framing of an ordinary friendship photograph would explain, close in the specific unposed way of 2 people who had forgotten, just for the half-second the shutter caught them, that anyone else in the world existed, a woman Mia had never seen before in her life. Dark, striking, laughing with her whole face turned toward Vivian's, one hand resting on the small of Vivian's back in a way that told Mia everything and nothing, all at once. Mia stood very still in her father's study, the wedding photograph in one hand and the other photograph in the other, and felt the specific vertigo of watching a wall she had always assumed was load-bearing turn out to be a curtain. She did not at first, think anything so complicated as her mother had a whole life I know nothing about. What she thought, in the very first instant, in the unfiltered, instinctive way thoughts arrive before you've had time to organize them into anything reasonable, was, oh. Oh, that's what that expression is. She had seen that exact expression on her own face, she realized, in photographs Priya had taken of her over the last 8 months. That particular defenselessness, the face doing something it hasn't been given permission to do, forgetting itself entirely. She was still standing there, both photographs in her hands, when Vivian came looking for her to ask about the vase. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when two people who love each other realize, in the same instant, that they are about to have a conversation neither of them planned for, and neither of them can now avoid. It has a texture. It has weight. Vivian felt it the moment she stepped into the study and saw her daughter's face, and understood, before a single word was spoken, exactly what Mia was holding. Mum. Mia's voice was very quiet, which was somehow worse than if she'd been loud. Who is this? For one long, suspended moment, Vivian considered lying. She had, after all, 30 years of practice at exactly this, at the small, smooth deflection, the change of subject, the closed door delivered so gently the other person barely feels it shut. She opened her mouth to do it, to say something about an old university friend, a colleague from the archive, anyone, anything, and found, for the first time in 3 decades, that the mechanism simply would not engage. The note in her evening bag seemed to grow heavier by the second, as though it had weight enough to anchor the truth in place and stop it sliding back under the surface. Her name is Josephine, Vivian said. Jo. Mia looked down at the photograph again, then back up at her mother, and something in her expression, Vivian would think about this for a long time afterward, was not shock, exactly. It was recognition. It was the look of someone finding a missing piece of a puzzle they hadn't fully realized was incomplete. You loved her. It wasn't a question. Mia's voice had gone strange, thin, urgent in a way that had nothing to do with judgment, and everything to do with something Vivian couldn't yet name. Before Dad. You loved a woman before Dad. Mia. Are you? Mia stopped, started again, and Vivian watched her 29-year-old daughter, poised for weeks to make her own confession over dessert, find herself instead standing in a study, holding proof that the woman she'd planned to confess to had a secret of her own, one that made the whole shape of the evening she'd rehearsed, suddenly, violently irrelevant. Mum, I came here tonight to tell you something, about Priya, about me and Priya. I've been terrified for a month that you were going to look at me like I'd ruined something. And you're standing here with a photograph of you and a woman who's touching you like... Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the word. Like that. Like she's touching you like that. The room went very quiet. Somewhere beyond the study door, the sound of the dinner party continued, oblivious, warm, Edward's laugh rising once above the general murmur. You're gay, Mia said. And it wasn't an accusation. It came out closer to wonder, closer to grief, closer to something that hadn't yet decided what it was going to be. Or, I don't even know what you'd call it, but you loved a woman, and you never told me. All these years I was so afraid of what you'd think, and you already... It wasn't the same, Vivian said, too quickly, and heard how thin it sounded even as she said it. Wasn't it? Vivian did not have an answer for that. Not one she could produce out loud, standing in her husband's study on their 30th wedding anniversary, with her daughter's eyes, Jo's eyes, she thought suddenly, absurdly, though of course they weren't. They were her own eyes reflected back at her through her daughter's face, filling with tears that were not entirely about betrayal, and not entirely about grief, but some third thing that didn't have a clean name. There's a note, Vivian heard herself say. She left me a note today. Under the door. She's back in London. She wants to meet me. At the bridge. In this photograph, actually. That bridge. Mia stared at her mother for a long moment, and when she spoke again her voice had changed register entirely, gone low and careful, the voice of someone realizing the ground under a conversation has shifted twice in 5 minutes and is still shifting. Are you going to go? If you're still with us, you already know this isn't the kind of story that resolves itself in a tidy sentence. And if it's found something in you already, that's worth sharing with someone else who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there is a person carrying exactly this kind of folded, 30-year-old note of their own. Stay with me. It gets harder before it gets clear. Vivian did not answer her daughter's question. Not directly, not that night. What she did instead was something she would later understand as the third turn in a story that had already turned twice without her fully realizing it. Because there was a piece of the puzzle neither she nor Mia yet possessed, and it was standing, at that exact moment, in the doorway of the study with a bottle of wine in each hand and an expression that had gone, in the space of one sentence overheard through a door not quite closed, from festive to utterly still. Edward had come looking for more wine. He had heard, walking down the hall, only the last handful of words. She left me a note today. She wants to meet me at the bridge. Enough. Enough to stop him in the doorway the way a man stops when the floor he's been standing on for 30 years turns out to have a trapdoor he never knew was there. But what he said next was not what either woman in that room expected, and it is the second great turn in this story, the one that recontextualizes not the past 30 years, but Edward Ashworth himself, entirely, in the space of about 4 sentences. "Josephine Calloway," he said. Not a question. Vivian turned. "How do you—" "I've known her name for 28 years, Vivian." Edward set the wine bottles down on the desk with great care, as though they were the only steady thing in the room, and he needed something to hold on to. His voice was not angry. That, somehow, was the most disorienting thing of all, the complete absence of the anger both women had braced, instinctively, for. "I found a box of letters in the attic of the Highgate flat, back before Mia was born. I wasn't looking for anything. I was looking for the Christmas decorations. There were 4 letters. I read the first one before I understood what I was reading, and then I couldn't stop, and then I never told you. Because by the time I finished reading them, I understood something I don't think you've ever let yourself fully understand." "What?" Vivian said, very quietly. "Did you understand? That you never really chose me over her?" Edward's voice was steady, almost gentle, and it was this gentleness, more than anything, that undid something in Vivian's chest. "You chose safety over both of us. She wasn't safe. And by the time I came along, I don't think you were choosing me so much as you were choosing to stop bleeding. I decided a long time ago that I could live with being the safe choice, if it meant I got to spend my life with you. I want you to know that was my choice, made with my eyes open, and I have never once regretted it. Not because I didn't know, Vivian, but because I did." Mia made a small sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, the sound of a woman watching both of her parents become, in real time, people she had never fully met before. 28 years, Vivian repeated, faintly. "You've known for 28 years and you never— What would telling you have done, except made you leave sooner?" Edward's smile, when it came, was sad but entirely without cruelty. "I loved you enough to let you have your secret. I'm telling you now because I think the woman standing in my study right now, holding that photograph, deserves to know her mother better than I let her know her father. And because I think there's a note in your bag, and a bridge, and a sunset that isn't going to wait for us to finish this conversation. There is one more piece, and it belongs to Constance Ashworth, dead 6 years now, and it arrives the way the truest and cruelest revelations often do, not delivered by the person who caused the damage, who is long past explaining herself, but excavated afterward from the things she left behind. Edward went to the attic himself, that night, while the dinner guests were finishing coffee downstairs and Mia sat with her mother in the study, with the door properly shut this time, and came back down with a small tin box, the kind that once held biscuits and had been repurposed, the way things were in Constance's generation, to hold whatever mattered too much to throw away and too much to leave in plain sight. Inside it, among expired ration books and a christening gown yellowed with age, was a letter Vivian had never seen. It was in Joe's handwriting. It was dated 6 weeks before Joe left for New York 30 years ago, and it was addressed to Vivian, and it had never once, in 3 decades, reached her. "I know your mother thinks this is a phase," Joe had written. In the slanted hand Vivian would have known blind. "I know she's told you it will pass, and that you're young, and that this is simply what young women do before they settle. I don't think that's true, and I don't think you think it's true either. Not underneath. I'm asking you properly, the way I should have asked you months ago, instead of assuming we both already knew. Come to New York with me, not as a friend. Not as anything you'd have to explain to anyone who didn't already understand. I know what I'm asking. I know what it would cost you. I'm asking anyway, because the alternative is spending the rest of my life wondering, and I don't think I can do that. Meet me at the bridge on the 14th. If you come, I'll know. If you don't, I promise I'll never make you explain it to me. I'll simply understand, and I'll go, and I won't ask again." There was a second piece of paper folded inside the first, in a different hand entirely, brisk and slanting the opposite direction, unmistakably Constance's. It had clearly been drafted, revised, and copied out fair, before being sent in Vivian's stead, in Vivian's name, without Vivian's knowledge. A short, devastating letter thanking Miss Calloway for her friendship over the past months, and explaining, with the particular icy courtesy Constance reserved for the destruction of things she found inconvenient, that Vivian had come to understand her feelings had been a passing confusion, that she wished Miss Calloway every success in New York, and that she thought it best, given the circumstances, that they not correspond further. Vivian did not go to the bridge on the 14th, 30 years ago, because she never knew there was a 14th to go to. She had believed, for 30 years, in a private, carefully maintained story in which Joe left for a residency, and the distance simply proved too much, in which no one had chosen anything, in which the ending had simply happened to both of them, evenly, like weather. She had built an entire adult life, an entire understanding of herself as a woman who had weighed love against safety and rationally, if sadly, chosen safety, and it had never once been a fair fight. Her mother had reached into the scale with both hands and taken love off it entirely, 30 years before Vivian ever got the chance to weigh it herself. She sat in the study with the letter in her hands and felt something she did not have a word for. Grief, certainly, but also a strange, retroactive fury on behalf of a 24-year-old woman she barely recognized anymore. A fury that had nowhere left to go because the person who deserved it had been dead for 6 years and could no longer be confronted, only understood, which is so much harder. "She never got a choice either," Mia said quietly, watching her mother's face. "Grandma made the choice for her. You've spent 30 years thinking you gave something up. You didn't give anything up, Mum. It was taken." Vivian looked up at her daughter, and then, slowly, at her husband standing in the doorway, and then at the clock on the study wall, which read 7:20, and outside the window, the light had already begun to go the particular color it goes in early autumn in London, gold sliding toward rust. "I have to go," Vivian said. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't going to hand you a clean answer at the end, and that's exactly why it's worth sharing with someone who's ever wondered whether it's too late to go back for something they left behind. The ending is close now. It's going to stay with you longer than you expect. She almost didn't. This is the part of the story that Vivian would return to, turning it over for years afterward, regardless of how the rest of it resolved. The 20 minutes between the study and the front door, during which she stood at the hall mirror in her good navy dress, her coat half on, and told herself, in the old practiced voice, that this was madness, that there were 12 people in her front room, that Edward had just handed her a truth larger and more generous than she felt she deserved, and the correct response to that generosity was surely to stay, that whatever Joe wanted to say could be said in a letter, in a phone call, in some form that didn't require her to walk out of her own anniversary dinner, in front of God and Alistair and everyone. She took her coat back off. She hung it on the hook. She stood in the hallway with her hand on the door, the same door. the same threshold where the whole evening had cracked open 4 hours before. And for a moment it seemed the story might simply close itself quietly, the way these stories so often do, with the door staying shut, and the ordinary evening reasserting itself, and 30 years of practiced smoothness winning, one final time, the way it had always won before. It was Mia who put the coat back into her hands. "She's losing her memory, Mum." Mia had followed her into the hall, still holding the 2 photographs, old and new versions of her mother, side by side in her fingers. "Doesn't that change something? A diagnosis like that? It's not a woman playing games with you after 30 years. It's a woman who might not remember this bridge, or this city, or maybe even your face, in a year, in 2 years. She came back now because now is what she has. And you're standing here deciding whether an evening of small talk with Uncle Alistair is worth more than that. How do you know about the diagnosis?" "It's in the note, on the back. You didn't read the back." Mia turned the folded cream paper over. Vivian hadn't, in 4 hours of carrying it against her ribs, thought to turn it over. And there, in smaller writing, hurried in a way the front of the note was not, was a second, shorter message. "Early onset, that's what they're calling it. I'm still myself most days. I wanted to see you while I still am. I'm not asking you to stay, Viv. I'm asking for 1 hour where I still remember exactly why it mattered." Vivian read it twice. Something in her chest, already cracked since 4 o'clock that afternoon, gave way entirely. "Go," Edward said, from the study doorway, and his voice was rough in a way she had rarely heard it. "Vivian, go. I mean it. Whatever happens on that bridge happens. I'm not going to be the reason you don't find out." The walk from Marylebone to the river took 18 minutes at Vivian's pace, which was faster than her pace had been in years, and she spent every one of those minutes half in her own body and half 30 years in the past, so that by the time she came down the steps onto the pedestrian walkway and felt the particular cold that always came off the Thames at that hour, she was no longer entirely sure which decade she was standing in. The bridge was busier than it had been 30 years ago. More tourists, more phones raised to the sunset, more noise. But the light was the same. That was the thing that struck her hardest, more than any of the rest of it. The sky was doing exactly what it had always done at that hour in early autumn. Gold sliding into rust, rust sliding into the deep bruised blue that comes just before true dark. And against that light, halfway across the bridge, standing at the railing with her back to the current the way she always used to stand, was Joe Calloway. She had gone gray. Of course she had gone gray. 30 years does that. But she stood the same way, weight settled on one hip, one hand resting on the railing as though she'd been holding that exact spot down for 3 decades waiting for Vivian to come back and reclaim it. She turned before Vivian said anything, before Vivian's footsteps on the old boards had even fully registered, the way she always used to turn, as though some part of her had never stopped listening for that particular set of footsteps in a crowd. "You came," Joe said. Her voice had the same low, unhurried quality Vivian remembered from 100 nights in a Soho basement, though there was something new in it now, a slight, careful precision, the voice of someone who has learned to hold on to her words a little more tightly than she used to. "I told myself I'd give it until the light went, and then I'd go home and tell myself I did the right thing leaving it up to you. I read the note 3 times before I understood it was really you," Vivian said, and found that her voice was shaking. "I read the back 4 hours after I read the front. I almost didn't write the back." Joe's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Didn't want you coming out of pity. I didn't come out of pity." "No," Joe said, studying her. The same unhurried attention Vivian remembered from a basement club 30 years ago. The specific look of someone deciding, in real time, that they had found exactly what they'd been looking for. "I don't think you did." They stood at the railing together, the way they used to, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, the current moving beneath them the way it had moved every day for 30 years, regardless of what either of them had done with their lives above it. Vivian told her, in pieces, in the halting, non-linear way true things get told, about the letter in the tin box, about Constance, about the reply that had gone out in Vivian's name without Vivian's knowledge. Joe listened, and something in her face. Vivian watched it happen, in real time, the way you watch a long-carried weight finally set down, eased, very slightly, for the first time in what might have been 30 years. "I used to think you just decided I wasn't worth the risk," Joe said quietly. "I built a whole life around telling myself that story. Every stage I ever played, every city I ever moved to. Some part of it was proving to a version of you that I made up in my head that I could survive being left. I'm going to have to spend whatever time I have left rebuilding a different version of it. I don't know if that's better or worse." "I don't know either," Vivian said honestly. "I've spent 30 years believing I chose safety over you, and it turns out I never got the choice at all. I don't know which is worse, thinking you gave something up freely, or finding out it was taken from you before you ever got the chance." Joe reached into her coat pocket and drew out something small, and Vivian's breath caught before she even fully saw what it was, because some part of her already knew. A scrap of manuscript paper, folded soft at the creases from 3 decades of handling, 4 bars of music in pencil. "You kept it," Vivian said. "You kept yours," Joe said. And it wasn't a question, because she could see, in Vivian's face, in the sudden helpless brightness of her eyes, that she had. They stood together as the light went from rust to that final deep blue, 2 women in their 50s on a bridge that had been theirs 30 years before either of them had learned the full cost of what they'd lost, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left that needed explaining, and everything left that needed deciding, and the 2 things could not, it turned out, be separated as easily as either of them might once have hoped. "I'm not asking you to leave your life," Joe said finally, into the specific quiet that had settled between them, the city noise going soft and distant, the way it does when you stop noticing it. "I want to be honest with you, because I don't know how many more honest conversations I'm going to get to have while I still remember every detail of this bridge, this conversation, your face right now exactly as it is. I don't know what's coming. Some days I forget words. Last month I forgot, for about 4 minutes, the name of the street I've lived on for 11 years. I'm not going to pretend that isn't terrifying, or that it isn't going to get worse. I came back because I wanted one evening where you knew exactly why you mattered to me, while I could still say it properly. Whatever you decide to do after tonight, go home, stay, something in between that neither of us has a name for yet. I need you to know I'm not asking you to fix 30 years in 1 hour. I'm just asking you to be here for the hour." Vivian looked at her. Really looked. The way she hadn't let herself look at anyone in a very long time. Past the gray and the new lines and the small, careful precision that had crept into Joe's voice. All the way down to the woman who had once found her in a crowded basement club and simply decided, without asking permission from anyone, that she was worth finding. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent in its suddenness, that there was no answer to give tonight that would resolve into something clean. There was a husband 4 hours worth of new and devastating honesty into a conversation that wasn't finished. There was a daughter standing at a door somewhere behind her, watching her mother become, in the space of one evening, an entirely different woman than the one she'd grown up with. There was a dying woman on a bridge, not dying, not yet, but losing herself in pieces, on a schedule no one could fully predict, asking for nothing except to be seen, clearly, one more time, by the one person who had always seen her most clearly of all. And there was Vivian herself, 54 years old, standing at the exact point on a bridge where she had once let go of something without ever fully understanding that it had been taken, rather than given up, trying to decide what a woman does with a second chance that arrives dressed as a tragedy, 30 years and one entire life too late, or, impossibly, unbearably, exactly on time. "I don't know what I'm going to do," Vivian said, and it was the truest sentence she had spoken in 3 decades. "I don't know if there's a version of tonight where I walk back through that door and it's the right choice, or a version where I don't and it's the right choice. I think I've spent so long being certain about everything that I forgot certainty was ever optional. You don't have to know tonight, Joe said. You just have to be here right now. That's all I came back for. The sun went the rest of the way down while they stood there, gold and rust folding fully into blue, and then into the particular deep gray violet that passes for dark over the Thames in a city that never quite goes properly black, street lamps flickering on one by one along both banks, like something exhaling. Mia stood at her parents' front door for a long time after her mother left, the two photographs still in her hand, the wedding photograph and the other one, the bridge, the laughing woman, the version of her mother she had never been allowed to meet until tonight, and watched Vivian's shape grow smaller down the street in the fading light, coat collar up against the cold coming off the river a mile away, walking with a kind of urgency Mia had genuinely never once seen in her before. Edward came to stand beside her in the doorway, and for a while neither of them said anything. Behind them, the dinner party continued in its diminished, confused way. Alistair had been told, vaguely, that Vivian had gone to deal with a family emergency, which was, in its way, entirely true. "Do you think she's coming back?" Mia asked finally. Edward was quiet for a long moment, watching the empty street where his wife had disappeared around the corner toward the river. "I don't know," he said. "I've been married to your mother for 28 years, and I don't think I actually know the answer to that. I know she loves me. I've never once doubted that. Not tonight, not with everything I've just found out. I also know I've spent almost 3 decades being the safe harbor for a woman who never got to choose whether she wanted a harbor or a horizon. I don't think that's fair to either of us, whatever she decides tonight." He looked down at his daughter, and something in his face softened, the way it used to when she was small and frightened of something ordinary. Thunder, the dark, the first day of school. "I do know that whatever she decides, it isn't going to be about whether she loves me enough. It's going to be about whether she's brave enough, at 54, to want something without needing it to be safe first. That's not a question I can answer for her. I don't think you can either. I don't even think she can answer it standing on that bridge tonight. Some things you don't decide in an hour. You decide them the next morning, and the morning after that, one ordinary day at a time, for the rest of your life." Mia looked down at the two photographs again, her mother laughing in ivory silk, looking at nothing, and her mother laughing on a bridge 30 years earlier, looking at everything, and thought about Priya, waiting for her call, waiting to hear how the evening had gone, waiting to find out whether Mia's mother was the kind of woman who closed doors, or the kind who, given a second chance at 40 degrees past midnight in her own life, might finally learn how to leave one open. "I was so scared to tell her about Priya," Mia said quietly. "I thought she wouldn't understand. Turns out she's the only person in this family who'd have understood completely." "She still might surprise you tonight," Edward said, "in more ways than one." They stood together at the door, father and daughter, in the cooling evening air, watching the empty street, waiting the way people wait when they've stopped being able to predict what happens next in their own family, and behind them the candles burned low, over a table set for 12, half the seats now occupied by people quietly wondering, and the clock on the mantel went on ticking the way it always had, indifferent, exact, keeping time in a house that had just discovered it did not, in fact, know its own history nearly as well as it had assumed. Somewhere across the city, on a bridge that had already given up 2 people once and was being asked, 30 years later, whether it might be persuaded to give one of them back, Vivian Ashworth stood at the railing in the last of the light and had not yet said the word that would end this evening one way or the other. The city moved around her the way it always does, indifferent to any single life inside it. Boats sliding under the arches, a train rattling somewhere in the middle distance, 2 women at a railing who had once known exactly how this story was supposed to end, and had learned, over 30 hard years, that it hadn't ended the way either of them believed. We don't know, watching from here, which way she'll turn when she finally does. Maybe she goes home, back to the candles and the good linen, and a husband who has just proven he can hold more truth than she ever gave him credit for, and finds, in that ordinary house, a way to build something new out of everything that's just been said aloud for the first time. Maybe she doesn't go home at all. Not that night, and maybe not many nights after, and finds out, in her mid-50s, whether it really is possible to begin a life she was never allowed to choose the first time. Maybe the truest answer is something in between. Something none of the people in this story, not Vivian, not Joe, not Edward, not Mia, standing at that door with two photographs of two different women who happen to be the same person, has a name for yet. What we do know is this: somewhere between a locked hallway drawer holding 30 years of folded paper and a tin box in an attic holding a lie one mother told to save her daughter from a life she couldn't imagine surviving, and a bridge that keeps offering the same two people the same impossible choice one more time, there is a question that doesn't resolve just because the story does. Is there an age at which it's still permitted to begin again? Or are there choices, made for us before we're old enough to understand what's being taken, that really do close a door forever, no matter how many decades later someone finally finds the key? Vivian doesn't know the answer standing on that bridge, in the last gray light before full dark. Neither, if we're honest, do we. If this story found something in you, if some part of you recognized the particular ache of a door closed 30 years too soon, or the terror of confessing something you've spent your whole life hiding, or the strange grace of discovering the people you love have been carrying more than they ever let you see, that feeling is worth more than a passive scroll past. That like is a way of saying, I saw this story. I honor the woman who spent 30 years folding a piece of paper soft at the edges, and the man who loved her enough to let her keep a secret, and the daughter who found her own courage reflected backward through her mother's hidden history. Share it with someone who's ever wondered whether it's too late for them to want something honestly. And subscribe to the channel, because there are so many more stories like this one, still folded up somewhere, waiting for someone to finally read the other side.